Okay, this is the second attributions lecture. The purpose of this lecture is to talk about some effortful attributions. Basically, what we'll be doing here is we will go over why we even talked about Weiner's model to begin with and why that is important for motivation. So, Weiner's model again, importantly, these causal reasons that we are thinking of and the attributions that we're making have very important implications for our own individual motivation. And so, again, just as a reminder, these attributions based on the model we're talking about here are the combination of controllability, whether something is internal or external, and stability. And yeah, these attributions can really influence both our expectations and our emotions. So, an example of an expectation. So, let's say we attribute something to be under our control. And this would likely lead to something we've talked about before, which is the expectation that our resources meet our demands. An emotional example here is, let's say we view something as external. So maybe someone either doesn't help us or harms us in some way. That's external, right? And it's likely that we will be angry at that person who harmed us or didn't help us. And then these expectations and emotions lead to various behaviors. Like if we think that our resources meet our demands, we believe then that we can actually go and do whatever this task is, right? And so based on that, we're more likely to follow our goals. Additionally, if we are angry at someone else who we perceive to have harmed us, some external sources that has harmed us, we will be more likely to act aggressively. So there's kind of a linear model here where we go from attributions that we make to expectations and emotions, and then finally to our behaviors and our actions. So to go through a couple examples of this, let's say we fail a task, whatever that might be. Could be something for school, an essay, something for work. Maybe you lose at your sporting event, something like that. And then one way to perceive that is as low ability, and we really do not like um, blaming things on low ability for ourselves. And so attributions that are associated with this would be internal, right? It's our own ability. So that's an internal thing. Stable ability is can change, right? But it takes a long time. So relatively over time, ability is typically pretty stable. And then this is also an uncontrollable thing. And this leads to various psychological and emotional outcomes like low self-esteem, low expectations, and shame, and then can finally lead to behaviors such as disengagement and poor performance. We'll actually talk about in the next lecture something called learned helplessness, which is associated with this type of combination of attributions, and can be really detrimental to overall motivation and performance. However, we can also look at a task failure in a different way. We can look at that failure as occurring due to low effort. And so low effort here is associated with attributions of being internal. Again, that's something that's up to us. We can decide how hard we try in a task, right? This is likely unstable. Let's say, for an example, you failed an exam or something because you went out and went to a party beforehand, drank a lot or something like that. That's a relatively unstable thing going to that party. And finally, this will be perceived as controllable. Unlike with low ability, a psychological outcome is maintaining high expectations. It's because when we believe that we just didn't try very hard, right? We still will likely have the belief that, okay, well, if I do try hard, I can succeed at whatever this task is. Therefore, high expectations. A potential emotional outcome would be guilt. And this can lead to behaviors such as increased effort or persistence, because again, we're placing the blame on low effort. So we're going to be more likely to say, okay, well, I just need to try harder next time. And then that um, typically is involved with improved performance. And so, as you can see, both of these were task failure examples, but there are very different emotional and behavioral outcomes depending on what our attributions are. So again, as I mentioned, we really don't like um, blaming things on our own low ability. And so one way we avoid doing this, one maladaptive way we avoid doing this, is by self-handicapping. And so what self-handicapping is it's creating impairing conditions in order to excuse a poor performance. So in other words, instead of, oh, I performed badly, that's my fault, it's an ability level thing, that switches to, oh, I performed badly because of this thing that I did. And if I just don't do that thing, then I'll do well at whatever the task is. Again, sporting event, work thing, exam, whatever that might be. And this occurs before the task, the self-handicapping behavior, that is, occurs before the task. Some popular scenarios where self-handicapping might occur are when we have non-contingent success. So this basically just means when we do well at a task, but we don't really know why. Like if you do really well on an exam, but maybe there's multiple choice and you feel like you actually knew that much, but you still got a good score. And then if you're asked to then, okay, go and take the second exam and repeat that, that's then not contingent success. And this is a very popular scenario for self-handicapping. Additionally, when there are audiences, we're likely to use self-handicapping behaviors as well. So this can look like, drinking or taking drugs or something before an exam, so that you could just say, oh, I did poorly on this exam because I was drunk or really hungover, or maybe because while I was studying, I was listening to really loud music and not actually focusing that much. So it's not my fault, right? That's the basis behind self-handicapping, to take the blame away from our own ability levels. An interesting and classic self-handicapping study is the Spurglis and Jones study. Basically, they told people that they would be taking a test, and they also told the participants that they were studying the effects of a drug called pandacrine, which actually isn't a real thing. It's a made-up drug, and was really just a sugar pill. But they told participants that if you take this pill, it'll probably impair your performance. And so before this, they had participants complete a task, and there were two conditions for this. Either they had participants complete an easy task, which is these two contingent here, or complete a difficult task. But interestingly, no matter whether participants did the easy or the hard task, they were told that they succeeded, even though, if in the hard task, they probably didn't. But that sets up the non-contingent success, right? So yeah, they were told that they succeeded and that they were expected to do just as well in this next task or test. And the dependent variable, just on the y-axis here, is whether or not the participants took this drug. And as you can see, those in the contingent condition, or those who had that easy initial task, and I'm like, okay, this is doable. If the second task is going to be similar, I got it. We're much less prone to take the pandacrine versus the non-contingent, whether they were asked if they wanted to take the pandacrine in private or if they were asked in public. It didn't really matter too much, but those who did the hard task initially really were much, much more likely to take that pandacrine, right? And this is self-handicapping, because then if they don't end up succeeding on that second task, it's because, oh, you told me that this pill would probably impair my performance, and this is no longer an evaluation of my actual abilities. So some consequences of self-handicapping: there can be some short-term advantages, including shifting our attributions from low ability to low effort. Again, we feel better about these low effort attributions, and actually these low effort attributions can lead to some more adaptive behaviors in the future. But or additionally, we also feel higher short-term self-esteem because we don't have that um, negative feelings, those negative feelings that come with uh, our when we were putting blame on our ability. Some disadvantages, though, these are more long term, which is why self handicapping in general is pretty maladaptive, are lower achievement, right? If you're doing self handicapping behaviors over and over, going to parties instead of studying for tests or whatever it might be, maybe watching Netflix over and over and then not studying because of just watching that TV. This will eventually, right, lead to substantially lower achievement usually. This can also lead to, in some scenarios, decreased liking by others. An example of this would be group projects, right? If you see someone doing these self-handicapping behaviors over and over, it's probably not someone that you're going to want in your group projects. You don't feel like you can rely on them to actually go about putting in the effort and getting their work done. While there might be short-term self-esteem benefits, there are definitely long-term self-esteem disadvantages because there's a decrease in achievement, right? And therefore there's a decrease in accomplishments. And so we don't have those accomplishments to feel good about. And finally, there's definitely decreased subsequent motivation and intrinsic interest. So it's really, when we're using a lot of self-handicapping behaviors, it's really hard to find that flow that we talked about previously. One thing that we haven't really talked too much about yet is attributions of the behavior of others. So some external attributions, and I mean behaviors of others that influence us. So for an example, again, briefly brought up a few slides ago, an example of when someone else either harms or hurts us. And so this is external, unstable, and we usually feel like we can control this with our own behaviors in that situation. And a common psychological outcome of this, very common when we feel as though others are impeding us or harming us, is anger. And oftentimes associated, not always, but oftentimes associated with anger is then acting in an aggressive fashion. So I want to finally, last slide here, point out the hostile attribution bias and show that we make different attributions of the self and others. So in this study, this is a study of children. This is a very just a brilliantly set up study, really. But the children were set into two classes, not two conditions, groups, based on teacher and peer reviews for whether they were aggressive or non-aggressive typically. And in this study, participants were asked to put together a puzzle and were told that across the hall, there was a different child who was working on a puzzle as well, and that at a certain point, they would switch and work on the other child's project. When after that switch, the participant child then hears a large crash, and the crash is supposed to be a sound of the puzzle breaking, and so that's the puzzle that the actual participant was originally putting together. And that child, the participant, is told one of three things: either in the hostile condition, told that, oh, the other child just broke your puzzle on purpose, or there's an ambiguous condition. For the hostile attribution bias, this is the interesting condition here, where it was unclear if the other child did it on purpose or not. And then there's one condition where the child was told that the other child broke their puzzle on accident. And what was measured was whether that participant child disassembled the other Confederate child's puzzle. And so as you can see, in this hostile condition, didn't really matter too much whether the participant child was classified as aggressive or non-aggressive. A little bit less than half the time they disassembled the other child's puzzle as a way of just retaliation and revenge. Interestingly, showing the hostile attribution bias is this ambiguous condition. And so in this ambiguous condition, those who were classified as aggressive were much more likely to then disassemble that puzzle, right? And so the idea here is that those children were making attributions of internal motives of the kid who broke the puzzle, as well as assuming or attributing hostile motives to that kid, versus here for the non-aggressive kids, it doesn't appear that way, right? They took that unclearness as, oh, it was probably more of an accident. And so that shows the hostile attribution bias here. Kind of depends on whether these children were classified as aggressive or non-aggressive, and that led to whether or not they were more likely to see intent in the other child and hostility in that other child as well. Something else I very briefly mentioned previously that I want to just quickly include in here, somewhat similarly, is the fundamental attribution error, which is where we are oftentimes more likely to attribute bad behaviors to internal reasons for others relative to ourselves. And so an example of this would be driving, right? If we see someone on the road that is driving really badly, it's common for us to be like, oh, you're a bad driver. That's, internal, it's your fault. It's an ability level thing and it's stable, almost like it's a trait to just be a bad driver, versus with us, we're more likely to be like, okay, that was just a situational thing, not internal. That happened. It's not my fault. It happened because of this or this. Yeah, I just want to mention that. It's something that's very large in the realm of social psychology. But anyways, that wraps us up here. In the next video, we'll talk about learned helplessness and self-efficacy.